Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now today we're taking a look at the performance of one of my favourite CPU and GPU combos, the 6-core Intel Core i5-12400F and the Nvidia RTX 3060 Ti 8GB. I've also paired these two with 16 gigs of dual channel 3200MHz DDR4. I do think there are probably better graphics card deals to be had. The 10 gig AMD 6700 and 12 gig 6700 XT come to mind, but the i5 and RTX combo here will still do a solid job at 1080p and 1440p. With prices continuing to fall as well, there are some great 3060 Ti deals to be found. But let's get straight into it and start with the 1080p benchmarks. First up we have Apex Legends at 1080p with the highest settings, apart from spot shadows which were set to low. TSAA was also enabled. For the average we have 231, followed by a 1% low of 179 and a 0.1% low of 158. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 is up next. Here at 1080p we were using the balanced preset, although the only change I made was to the textures, which were set to high. SMAA T2X was enabled and the anti-aliasing quality was set to normal. For the gameplay we saw 127 FPS with a 1% low of 80 and a 0.1% low of 75. Not much in the way of stutter here if anything. Of course you can always turn things down a little more if you want to aim for say 144 FPS in these games instead, but I generally go for what I'd personally play at. In Cyberpunk 2077 we've gone with the high crowds, high textures and the high preset with nothing else changed apart from motion blur, which I turned off, as well as a few of the other visual options like chromatic aberration. The average frame rate was 112 FPS followed by a 1% low of 74 and a 0.1% figure of 63. A very nice smooth experience at 1080p, and you'll find that the i5-12400F is actually holding us back at this resolution in some scenarios. Forza Horizon 5 is more GPU intensive, and at the Ultra preset with TAA and nothing else changed, we were seeing 132 frames per second. The percentile lows were also very solid, and again, no problems to report here. Forza Horizon 5 is a very well optimized game that will run splendidly on this combination, which seems to be getting cheaper by the day. The i5-12400F is available of course on the used market, but prices of new CPUs seem to be going down as well. The 3060 Ti is a lot cheaper than it used to be, and from what I'm seeing on sites like eBay, here in the UK at least, it's continuing to fall. Fortnite with the high preset now and 100% scale with nanite off. This turns off some of those advanced lighting options which can play havoc with our frame rates. On average we saw 179 FPS with a 1% low of 62 and a 0.1% low of 29. Now there were some stutters here and there, but this is Fortnite after all, and this does occur on most hardware that I test with this game. Nothing off-putting in terms of gameplay though, and overall the experience was a pretty solid one. However, I probably recommend turning the settings down a little more if you want to ensure a higher and more consistent frame rate, just for the sake of remaining competitive. Grand Theft Auto 5 is an older game, but of course it's pretty much a classic at this point. Here we have the highest settings. We've also turned the advanced settings all the way up or enabled them, and for the anti-aliasing solution we've gone with FXAA because MSAA will absolutely drain the performance. On average we saw 128 FPS followed by a 1% low of 93 and a 0.1% low of 77. For Hogwarts Legacy, now this can be problematic on some Nvidia cards, well quite a few cards actually. We generally see lower percentile figures, meaning a few little dips and drops here and there. This was no exception. I'm using the high preset with TAA set to high as well. Now on average we saw 93 FPS, which was pretty good of course, and the 1% low was at 49, whereas the 0.1% low was at 36. Red Dead Redemption 2 up next with the ultra textures. Any other setting doesn't look that great to be honest, all else was set to high, but TAA was set to medium. The water physics were also set to medium, the geometry level of detail was maxed out, and the grass level of detail was set halfway at 5 out of 10. On average we saw a very nice 111 frames per second followed by some smooth and consistent percentile lows, so not much to worry about here, and visually the game still looks fantastic years after release. Spider-Man Remastered up next, very high preset here with TAA. Now I haven't included any ray tracing benchmarks in today's video, but I can do so if you want me to in another one. I don't really see the point in enabling it in a lot of these games, especially when we may have to make some sacrifices with DLSS or FSR. Here in Spider-Man, however, very high preset. We could have definitely got away with enabling the ray traced reflections, I think, because the average frame rate as it was 128, and our percentile lows were also very solid. These may dip a little bit more should we enable some of the more advanced settings, but I think the game looks really nice and plays really well with this configuration. The Last of Us Part 1 is quite demanding, as you know, and at 1080p we have the high preset here. The only thing I did change was the SSR setting, or screen space reflections, which I turned off because this does affect our frame rate by a few percent. I also disabled motion blur and depth of field as a personal preference. Here we saw 90 frames per second with a 1% low of 64 and a 0.1% low of 48. Now I've never been one for maxing out games, so to speak. I generally stay away from ultra settings, I always have done, because in a lot of titles you won't see a difference between high and ultra, yet the frame rate will or can be impacted quite significantly. So the settings I'm showing you today are probably the settings I'd stick with, especially for the sake of some of the 1 and 0.1% lows across the games we've looked at today. Finally, for our 1080p results, we have The Witcher 3 with the Ultra preset and TAAU. I know I just said I don't go with Ultra, but we can actually turn things up a little more, so this is sort of the second setting down. We have the Ultra Plus options as well, which I don't see a point in using over Ultra, but it is all down to personal preference, of course. With TAAU also enabled and Hairworks off, we were seeing 130 FPS with a few dips and drops as we made our way into busier areas, but nothing major at all, and the i5-12400F and 3060 Ti combo is still doing a great job. Let's move on to the 1440p benchmarks now. Now I will only show you the settings if I've had to change anything. If I don't show you the settings, then I've kept the settings the same as they were before with the 1080p results. So here in Apex Legends, once again we have the highest visual options with spot shadows low and TSAA enabled for an average of 162 FPS, followed by a 1% low of 110 and a 0.1% low of 107. In Call of Duty at 1440p, once again we were using the balance preset with the high textures, and once again we were testing this map because it tends to be more demanding than the others. The frame rate here was 100 FPS with a 1% low of 73 and a 0.1% low of 68, so things were pretty smooth and pretty consistent. Cyberpunk 2077, now I had to turn things down here just for the sake of keeping at least 60 FPS. I kept the high crowds, however, the high textures also remained, but I went with the medium preset with nothing else changed. On average we saw 72 FPS with a 1% low of 58 and a 0.1% low of 49. Even in and around those busier city areas, the frame rate still held up fairly well with a few little tiny dips below 60, but nothing really to complain about with this one, and it still looks absolutely fantastic at this resolution with these graphical options. Forza Horizon 5, here we are again, more GPU optimized. This one ultra preset with TAA once again for an average of 106, followed by some really solid percentile lows. Absolutely smooth as anything. Forza Horizon 5 generally runs quite well on a wide range of graphics cards, and the 3060 Ti was no exception. Fortnite on the 3060 Ti at 1440p actually felt a little bit smoother. The average was 137 and the 1% low was 91. That 0.1% figure did still give us a few problems, but overall it was a very smooth experience, again with 100% res scale and nanite turned off. For Grand Theft Auto 5 we remained with the highest settings. That includes the advanced settings on as well with FXAA. The average was 126 with a 1% low of 93 and a 0.1% low of 77. I was a little bit worried about Hogwarts Legacy at this higher resolution, but I decided to try and keep the high preset here and the TAA high options instead of dropping to medium, because I wasn't sure if we'd get above 60, but I had a feeling that we would just about do it. Now of course there will still be a few problems with those percentile lows, the same usual dips and drops, but overall the experience was okay and definitely playable in my opinion. but it totally depends of course on who's playing and whether or not you want more frames than this at this higher resolution. Red Dead Redemption 2, once again with the ultra textures and all else on high. Nothing else was changed here from the previous set of results. This time we saw 87 FPS, so still a solid plus 60 FPS experience, and our percentile figures remained fairly high and consistent too. This looks absolutely fantastic with this resolution, and we could probably push things to 2160p, albeit having to drop a few little things here and there for at least 60 FPS. Spider-Man, once again, very high preset with TAA still enabled, 101 FPS with a 1% low of 69, nice, and a 0.1% low of 61. So we have still got a very smooth and very consistent experience on our hands here, and Spider-Man looks and runs very well. For The Last of Us, this was another one I had to change. Just like Cyberpunk, I dropped the preset to medium here to remain with at least 60 frames per second. The average was 70, and there were a few drops below 60, not ones that were particularly noticeable, but ones that popped up with the benchmarking program. 55 FPS was that 1% low with a 1% low of 51. The game still looks really good, and the extra sharpness that 1440p brings to the table almost makes up for that lowered graphical preset, but I think medium still looks good, to be honest, even in comparison to the high preset, and I still happily play the game like this. Finally then we have The Witcher 3 at 1440p this time around. I've kept the ultra preset with TAA and Hairworks turned off. 92 FPS here with a 1% low of 62 and a 0.1% low of 55. If you want an i5-12400F and 3060 Ti in 2023, it is still capable of 1440p gaming as well, albeit with slightly reduced settings in a couple of the more demanding games that exist out there. That said, it's always worth considering your options. Take a look at the price of 6700 XTs, and also consider what else exists on the market that may be a little bit older but could perform on a similar level to the 3060 Ti as well. With all that said, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope that whenever you see this, it is helpful to you if this is something you've been looking for. If you've enjoyed this one, leave a like, leave a dislike if you didn't. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.